Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to wherever you are, to everyone joining us from your various locations all over the globe, which is what I know usually happens for our convenings. My name is Tina Campt, and I wear a number of different hats on and off of this Zoom screen. I am professor of humanities at the Kogut Institute for Humanities here at Brown, as well as a professor of modern culture and media. And I lead the Black Visualities Initiative here at Brown. I'm also one of the conveners of the Practicing Refusal Collective, and on behalf of my fellow collective members, I am delighted to welcome everyone to this 7th virtual installment of the Sojourner Project. As I've explained in each of the previous activations in this series, the Practicing Refusal Collective is a forum that has dedicated itself to fostering new dialogues on Blackness, anti-Black violence, and Black futurity in the 21st century. The collective initiated the Sojourner Project in 2019 as part of an effort to decenter the United States in our discussions and to learn from the insights and perspectives of African and African diasporic communities beyond the US. And over the past year, which has gone very, very rapidly, and in the face of the pandemic, we have partnered with the Visual Identities in Art and Design Center in Johannesburg, at the University of Johannesburg, and Art for Humanity in Durban, and as well as Yale University for this series of events. And for this particular episode, we are delighted to be joined by a new partner, the recently formed Center for the Study of Race, Gender, and Class at the University of Johannesburg. And you will see in the chat connections, links to be able to follow some of our partners. Should you want to continue to be involved in our work and in their work, you will also find a link to the sojournerproject.org, our website, where you will find information on all of the previous events in the series. Before I get started, I have to acknowledge the work of some of the people who made this transatlantic collaboration possible. On the South African end, we thank James McDonald, Victoria Collis Buthelezi, Ismail Farouk, and Russell Halungwane. And on the US end, we thank Tavia Nwango, Amanda Anderson, Damien Mahit, Traude Kastner, and Lewis and Kyle, our wonderful, wonderful tech folks, as well as Lisa Noble. We thank you all for assembling so many moving parts into what feels like a seamless whole. And now, without further delay, we're going to move on to the main event. Today's activation is, like all of our sessions, intended as an invitation to both think and rethink our selected keyword, aesthetics. It is the brainchild of our fellow collective members, Denise Ferreira da Silva and Rizvana Bradley. Today's activation is also an invitation to enter into an ongoing dialogue that extends all the way back and potentially before 2019 to a convening called the Loophole of Retreat, which took place on the occasion of Simone Lee's Hugo Boss Prize exhibition of the same name. It is an invitation as well to take up what Denise and Rizvana call an open proposition, which they published last month in the online journal eFlux, entitled 4 Theses on Aesthetics. And you will also find a link to that publication in the chat. Denise and Rizvana's 4 challenging theses will serve as a kind of armature for today's activation. And I'm very delighted right now to introduce my fellow collective members, Denise and Rizvana, and their talented crew of interlocutors. And I'm going to be introducing them with what I will apologize in advance for as very abbreviated bios for a really illustrious group of thinkers. So, to begin with, Rizvana Bradley is an assistant professor of film and media at UC Berkeley. Her scholarship and writing on contemporary art, film, and media has been published in numerous outlets, including Discourse, Black Camera, Film Quarterly, Art in America, and eFlux. She is a recipient of a Creative Capital, Andy Warhol Foundation Arts Writers Grant, and has curated a number of academic arts symposia, including events in the British Film Institute, the Serpentine Gallery, and the Stedelijk Museum of Art in Amsterdam. Denise Ferreira da Silva is a professor and director of the Social Justice Institute, GRSJ, at the University of British Columbia. Her academic writings include the books Toward a Global Idea of Race, Empire, and Crisis of the Subprime with Paula Chakravarti, and Unpayable Debt. She has a vibrant collaborative art practice that includes films, plays, operas, and publications with Valentina Desideri, Ross Martin, Arjuna Newman, Jota Mombaka, and Anti Ribeiro. She is a member of the collective Echo.org. Gabi Nkobo is an artist, curator, and educator living in Johannesburg, South Africa, engaged in collaborative artistic, curatorial, and educational projects in South Africa and internationally. Nkobo is a founding member of the Johannesburg-based collective platforms NGO, Nothing Gets Organized, and the Center for Historical Reenactments. In 2018, she curated the 10th Berlin Biennale entitled We Don't Need Another Hero, and was one of the curators of the 32nd Sao Paulo Biennale. In May 2021, Nkobo was appointed curatorial director at the Javet Art Center at the University of Pretoria. Joto Mombaka is a non-binary Bisha, born and raised in the northeast of Brazil, who writes, performs, and investigates the relations between monstrosity and humanity, queer studies, decolonial turns, political intersectionality, anti-colonial justice, redistribution of violence, visionary fictions, the end of the world, and tensions about ethics, aesthetics, art, and politics in the knowledge productions of the global South of the South. The Autolith Group was founded in London in 2002 by artists and theorists Angelica Segar and Kojo Eshin. The Autolith Group operates as a platform for research and dialogue while challenging the vertical divisions between the real and the imagined, history and fiction. Inspired by traditions of collective filmmaking, Segar and Eshin integrate moving image with audio, image, text, installation, and curation to convey imagination of futures engendered by the histories and presences of global African and Asian diasporas. The Autolith Group was shortlisted for the Turner Prize in 2010 and has been featured in solo exhibitions quite literally across the entire planet. And just to put two identities into the Autolith Group, Angelica Segar studied social anthropology at the University of London School of Oriental and African Studies. Segar works as a curator, moderator, essayist, film director, video maker, and photographer. And last but not least, Kojo Eshin is a filmmaker, theorist, and artist based in London. He is lecturer in contemporary art theory at Goldsmiths College and professor of visual arts at Haute École des Arts et Design in Geneva. Eshin is author of numerous essays and collections, including More Brilliant Than the Sun and The Ghosts of Songs, the film art of the Black Audio Film Collective, 1982 to 1998. The way in which we're going to try and work this is that we're going to first I'm going to invite Rizvana onto the stage, and they're going to be an alternating set of conversations that I will allow Rizvana to share with you now. So without further delay, welcome and take it away, Rizvana.
Thank you very much, Tina, for that introduction, and to everyone at the Kogut Center at Brown for making this event possible. Infinity, the world as the totalizing onto epistemology that is modernity's genesis, limit, and horizon, is a thoroughly aesthetic conceit. To toil within or rail against the field of representation is already to be enmeshed in the aesthetic, for it is by way of the aesthetic that the ontological ground on which we are said to stand becomes experience. In this register, man, the transparent I, the universal subject who would make the world, if not just as he pleases, appears, apropos Sylvia Wynter, as none other than Homo aestheticus. This is the ontological figure consolidated in post-Enlightenment European thought, whose presupposed capacity for self-determination and self-development is both indistinguishable from the expropriative displacement of ecological entanglement that animates biohistory, and further tantamount to the capacity for aesthetic experience and judgment. The subject's sensus communis, of course, only emerges through the constitutive excommunication of the savage, the conquered, the Negro, the commodity, the primitive, the other, and the traditional, the underdeveloped, figures who nevertheless come to haunt man as the bearers of an ontological dissonance, an imminent declension we might call Blackness. What else can be said about the conquered, the commodity, the other, and the underdeveloped, besides the fact that they apply to all who do not fall within the spatiotemporal borders of the post-Enlightenment figure of man? That is, the transparent eye. Not much would be the appropriate answer if all that is taken into account is what is offered by way of the constraints of dichotomous thinking. That is, if the question were not raised about the conditions under which the universal protective force held by the ethical would be extended to some humans, whether that force is bequeathed by the divine ruler or author in their mastery of the transcendental form that is reason. If the question were not raised, that is about why Blackness is so naturally visited by total and symbolic violence. When the categorical force of Blackness is confronted with the total violence that its historical trajectory cannot but recall, it cannot but refract and fracture the transparent shoal, the threshold of transparency that protects the subject's onto epistemology across his scientific and aesthetic moments. The total exposure of Blackness both enables and extinguishes the force of the modern ethical program, insofar as the disruptive capacity of Blackness is a question toward the end of the world. Blackness is a threat to sense, a radical questioning of what comes to be brought under the terms of the common. If the ordered world secures meaning because it is supposed to be knowable and only by man, if that world is all the common can comprehend, then Blackness returns existence to the expanse in the wreckage of space-time corpus infinitum. The Autolith Group's 2019 film, Infinity Minus Infinity, takes up different images of the entanglement of space and time through racial and colonial genealogies and their bearing on the planetary catastrophe that continues to unfold. How do we think about the concept of infinity in relation to the maps of history onto which modern progress is plotted?
Okay, thanks very much, Rizvana. Thanks to Tina, Rizvana for the invitation. Thanks to all the team working hard behind the scenes to make this happen. We prepared a response. We haven't timed it, might be 11, 12 minutes. So let's begin. It's called Parenthetical Blackness, From Quest to Question. A note on Rizvana Bradley and Denise Ferreira da Silva's first thesis on infinity.
How does social scientific knowledge justify the murder of people of color? My reply is, how does its arsenal explain it? Denise Ferreira da Silva, Towards a Global Idea of Race, 2007.
The inexhaustible, if still ruthlessly exhausting, question of how Black life does and does not come to matter draws us towards the coil, chasm, and threshold of life and death, their modern dispensation through and against Black being. Rizvana Bradley, The Weathering of Form, Jennifer Packer's Abstract Figures, 2021.
This Black Hamlet, and his name was Autolith, meaning a kind of minute calcareous body that makes it possible for a fish to be conscious of its position in space. Under the influence of gravity, otoliths will press downwards. As the position of the body moves, they will come into contact with sensory hairs in the ampullae, thus causing impulse to be transmitted to the brain by the auditory nerve. Because of the arrangement of the three canals in the three planes of space, from the dorsal part of the vestibule to the utriculus, provision is made for sensation of movements in all directions. Dambutso Marechera, The Black Insider, 1992.
To read the 4 theses on aesthetics is to encounter the ontological turn in Black studies, as elaborated by Denise Ferreira da Silva from Towards a Global Idea on Race, published in 2007, and onwards into the present.
It is to turn towards what Rizvana Bradley calls the racial metaphysics that creates the conditions for what appears in her recent essay, Picturing Catastrophe.
It is to return to what Bradley analyzes as the war unfolding beneath the facade of the visual that requires us to reflect upon representation as constituted by more than what is presumed to comprise an image.
It is to turn towards Dambutso Marechera's unnamed disreputable antagonist as he almost collides with Otolith, the disillusioned, transfigured, damned Black Hamlet that walks along a corridor of a ruined, deserted university faculty building in a war zone in the near future, dressed in Black Elizabethan clothing.
It is to turn towards an unrequited collision, which stages a dissonant meeting between differing, but not necessarily oppositional ways of navigating space, managing scale, and processing time.
In the glancing friction of Marechera's proleptic encounter can be read as an allegory for the processes, the project, and the practice of that which goes by the name of the Otolith group.
For the Otolith group, the morphological figure of the otolith operates as a kind of black box for withholding intention,
gauging impact, measuring expectation, and calculating discrepancy.
a sensorial compass for orienting traps, solicited as invitations,
camouflaged as participation, dissimulated as encouragement,
and framed as shareable.
A flight recorder for updating the coordinates required for a speculation upon matters of gravity and questions of grace.
Gradient, devotion.
Illumination, numinicity.
Force, mass.
Measure, motion.
Stasis, stance.
Style, rest.
Pose, posture.
Fermata, caesura.
Duress, duration.
Increment, interiority, introspection.
It is to attend to what De Silva calls the production of race as a constitutive human attribute.
The regulation of race as the globally regional differentiation of attributes of the human.
By the 19th century sciences of the human and the 19th century sciences of the social,
as the ontological solution to the unresolved ontological problem that the white mythologies of European philosophy posed itself.
the problem that animated white philosophy from the 17th century onwards.
The problem of how to protect the human in its ontological essence from the constraints of universal reason.
It is to attend to the role played by the racial in the manufacturing of man.
It is to engage with science, the human sciences, the physical sciences, the social sciences, as what De Silva calls the proper domain for the production of the truth of man.
The domain in which the sciences manufacture man as a sole and self-determined being.
What De Silva calls Homo modernus, what Bradley and De Silva call Homo aestheticus. This turn towards race as an ontologically relevant attribute is a challenge to British critical thought that proceeds from the assumption that race has been discredited as a scientific concept.
That race is ontologically irrelevant.
That racial subjection, racial domination, racial oppression, historically and in the present, operate through socio-historical processes of exclusion.
That exclude from universality those who are subject and subjected to racial subjection by banishing them from the universal.
That racial emancipation comes about when those that are racialized are juridically and economically included or enfranchised, when their voices, their cultural representation, their historical representation are finally realized as universal.
The problem with these presumptions for De Silva is not the desire to overcome racial subjugation or racial subjection. It is the assumption that to be racially subjected is to be excluded from the universal.
The assumption that the ambition, the aim, and the aspiration of the racial subject as a historical subject, subjected to historical processes, is to become finally a self-determining subject.
To become what De Silva calls a transparent I, that finally realizes themselves as a universal subject, recognizes themselves as universal subject, stakes its claim on and as universal humanity.
This goal for De Silva entails the racial subject reproducing the powers of the subject.
De Silva's project, by contrast, is to displace the powers of the subject, its self-determination, its self-development.
To work on and in and for the means and methods for refusing to return to man or the subject.
A refusal to turn towards the universality of the human or humanity, the ego or subject.
In favor of an aesthetic consideration of the object, which is anything other than the ontological dissonance of the savage, the inharmonious mixed ontology that is the Negro, the ontological incongruity of the primitive, the inconsistent ontology of the traditional.
This requires accounting for the racial as an inherently modern, post-Enlightenment strategy of power, rather than as an excessive ideological device imposed by the dominant class upon the exploited class.
In the four theses, Homo modernus can be understood as Homo aestheticus. To say that man is human insofar as he is aesthetic is to say that aesthetics is that which renders the ground of being human experientiable as experience.
It is to say that the fundamental anthropology of man is aesthetic. It is to say that aesthetics is that racial science within the human and social sciences of the 19th century that renders the being of the human experiential as human.
What role does aesthetics play in the racial manufacture of man as a globally regional entity in the second decade of the 21st century?
What role does it play in the extension and regulation of the modern program of the ethical?
Its role is in producing the sensus communis that stands for the aesthetic ground of universality. In Kant's operative system, the sensus communis, the common sense, is that which is latent in all beings, but is yet to be developed in that which Kant typifies as the savage.
The construction of the aesthetic ground of universality is the racial construction of ex-sensus. It is the simultaneous production of those figures that stand differentially before universality.
Those figures that are vestibular to the human in the words of Hortense Spillers.
That are excommunicated from what comes to be brought under the terms of the common.
Those ontological figures of the savage, the primitive, the Negro, the traditional.
Figures that are banished from that world that is all that the common can comprehend.
Figures that are anathema to the ordering of that world that secures its meaning of its existence because it is supposed to be knowable as such.
Figures that bear an imminent declension that might be nominated as what Bradley and De Silva call blackness in lowercase.
Declension, a bending from something, a bending aside, a turning away from something, an avoiding, to lower, to avoid, to deviate, to deflect.
Immanent, indwelling, remaining within. Inherent, to dwell in, to remain in.
To dwell in deviation, an indwelling avoidance, a turning, remaining away from something.
Some things do their own thing.
Other things go their own way.
Some ways have their own ways of doing what they do.
If blackness is parenthetical in its separated ongoing movement from a quest to a question,
From a turn to a return,
then one question for Bradley and De Silva might be to expand upon that final figure of expanse.
the figure of a world without determination, a figure between form and formal and the formless, a figure for that which is undeterminable.
The corpus as the body,
Infinitum as infinity,
limitless, eternal, that which is great in number,
limitless as a guide to the imagination of the end of a world,
that world,
that ordered world.
that world order.
Thank you.
Thank you. And yes, I'd like to thank Tina and the folks at Brown for bringing us together in this conversation, and I also thank the Otolith, Gabi and Jota for joining us. And I'm talking about the thesis on redecomposition, and the Otolith intervention just kind of embodied it. So let me just continue with the redecomposition. Thinking that our artwork as poetical, as a composition which is always already a recomposition and a decomposition of prior and posterior compositions, requires being poised for the advent of becoming as matter and its immanent interrogation of the temporality of forms. In contradistinction to understandings of the artwork as autonomous totality, or those that would consign the artwork to some iteration of Kant's forma finalis, that is, the reductive ascription of a formal purposiveness to the object, a poetical reading stresses the provisional ground where questions of form, formlessness, and abstraction collide. The artwork as a singular composite need not simply anticipate or reiterate questions which presume the formal principles of external causation, causa efficalis, interior determination, causa finalis, or abstract perception, causa formalis. For these senses, calcified as the only tools for comprehending nature, the realm of objectivity, and world, the kingdom of subjectivity, have sustained the tautology of modern thinking precisely through being rendered axiomatic. Once released from the anticipation of order and the presumption of meaning, the artwork becomes liberated from its representational obligations to nature and world. As a poetical piece, the artwork extends the questionings of causa materialis, the undeterminable of contemplation. Returning in as forms, a poetical descriptor for existence presumes neither linearity nor its predicates, separability and determinacy. The reorientation poetical art invites expresses the infinite redecompositions that normative space-time would foreclose. The axial intensities of verticality and horizontality, the strict linearity, the primary coloring that signal abstraction's formal legacy do not so much indicate a restrictive geometry or truncated chromaticity as an open set, where, for instance, even the fidelity of a line or the vertices of a square may be exacted with improvisatory emphasis. The poetical work deforms the teleological imperative of purposiveness and the racial demarcation of the incapacity for aesthetic judgment this imperative necessarily reinscribes. The poetical work tends towards the revelation that such an effort to reduce, discipline, and contain the unwieldy materiality of the world is always already an exercise in futility. We might think both of seriality and deformation not as formal deviations from the major paradigms of modernist art, but as aesthetic practices which enact the decomposition of the art historical canon and of canonicity as such. Such decomposition is achieved not by a method of subversion, but by the accumulation of subreptitious returns, which gather ruinously beneath the sign of the authoritative artwork. The serial proliferation of returns exposes the autonomous artwork as itself nothing more than a redecomposition, a contaminated assemblage of citations and deformations. And I'd like to invite my friend, Jota Mombassa.
So thank you so much for having me here. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you to everyone that is joining this talk, to all the participants, Denise, Rizvana, the Outlet Group, Tina, Gabinobo, and everyone doing it in the background. I'll be cutting off my camera just during my reading. I decided to share some sort of a letter or an intended conversation with a poet who is already dead, Bob Kaufman. So I'll be cutting my camera so we can connect sonically throughout the reading. I promise not to take very long. So Dad, when I'm gone, I shall be in the air. Someone said that you woke up that day as if you knew you were about to exit. You washed your mouth, you cleaned up your bedroom, you watered the plants, you bathed yourself, you dressed in white and left a glass of water on your bedside table. You died. I light a candle for calling you. I pray using your words. Hear me now. Hear me now. Always here somehow. I am thinking about you while I try to make sense of death as transmutation, while I try to tune myself with the heat of that candle. The fact that the world is burning enters the room where I live. I wake up to the pervasiveness of fire, surrounded by its flames and ashes, by its endangered species and displaced communities. The death it unfolds takes hold of the world. It crosses the narrative, burning ground, filling every silence and every voice with its massive, overwhelming indeterminacy. It is not a dream. I cannot simply escape fire towards reality, for reality itself is burning. I call you again without saying your name. I want to sit opposite to you, to look at your fingers dancing. Where do your words transit? How do they cross? The sound of your voice responds from a distance. I can already feel your presence manifested somewhere in the depth. But you are not here yet. So I read you. White tiger, I hear your hum on the drone, flowing on beds of fresh snow on springs, flowing back to the nether source. The truth is an empty bowl of rice. Those cat-hold men who cage you shall melt in the summer sun, for they are ugly bars who echo the sting of unruly rivers in their dried, cracked bed. I read myself. I watch a video of you dancing. I try to follow your hands. My attention goes from your fingers to the things they point to, somewhere outside the frame. In the description of the video on YouTube, someone says this is one of the few rare footage of you existing. It was your birthday. I wonder how old you were. I wonder how long you lived. I watch you stumbling, and for a second, I have the sensation that your instability announces an entirely other form of steadiness. Then you enter the room wearing your sailor hat and bring in a tiny red rose in your pocket. The fire spreads out of the candle, and my first reaction is to yell, "Let the sun in!" And so I read you again. I am the eternity that was held by the ostrich egg. The magnificent December is now no longer hidden. The sun, I am alone, is present forever. I get back to myself. You are that eternity that was held by the poem. So you, like the sun, is present forever. Even when forgotten, even when erased, even when they need to call you Black Humble in order to acknowledge you. You vanish right in front of their eyes, and yet you never ceases to be there. I read you. Someone who I am is no one. Something I have done is nothing. Someplace I have been is nowhere. I am not me. What of the answers I must find questions for? All these strange cities I must find cities for. I read myself. I have never lived anywhere near home. I feel tired of most things. I just want to lay down and wait. I just want to invite my way. I just want to stop this right now. May this intense repetition twist into a form of multiplication and nutrition. If instead of being held by the negative, one could channel negativity as a thunder that cuts the cage of the tiger and mine and yours truly. To be what is no one, as to do what is nothing, as to go what is nowhere, as in being what is not a being. Maybe the affirmation of nothing is a constitutive gesture of Black possibility. For it's an evasion of both objectives, autodetermination, subalternity, and subjectivity, self-determination, sovereignty. The poem, which is the ostrich egg that contains the sun and therefore eternity, is the continent of such extrapolation. The poet is most likely the extrapolation itself. I read you. In a universe of cells, who is not in jail? Jailers, in a world of hospitals, who is not sick? Doctors, a golden sardine is swimming in my head. Oh, we know some things, man, about some things, like jazz and jails and God. Saturday is a good day to go to jail. And so I read myself. I wanted to learn the language I was taught, this language in which every word is scheming for the reproduction of our unintelligibility. We are simultaneously made as an incognito and driven towards language. In Odette and Bruno's play, I read a sentence about only having the language that replicates our existence. It was written in the wall with the language that replicates our existence. There is a scene in my head and I'm scared. In the last 3 days, I've been trapped in a negative spiral. Pessimism is just as toxic as the belief in the truth, in the future, and in the good. If we at least knew how to hack the effects of anxiety towards other directions, how to learn with it. But one grows sick and then feels disposable. We are always in the threshold or at the corner of anything. As an homage to Conceição Evaristo, us agreed not to die. We would also need them to agree not to kill us. I know they are just outside, didn't notice when they settled, but I can feel them moving right at the spine of all my traumas. They are the ones who die us, in spite of what us have agreed. In the meantime, my ex-therapist goes somewhere, you are bigger than your trauma. My ex-lover, in the day I was harassed by an old Portuguese lady on the street, told me the exact same thing. She called the police and I said, Mr. Policeman, I am bigger than you. I am bigger than all the Portuguese old ladies who have learned to treat my body as a trash. I am bigger than economic situations, than messed up migration, and I am bigger than my collapsed walls. The feel that I owe something is so recurring, even if it no longer stops me to tell them again, always them, that I owe nothing, that the death is their heritage. I wrote with blood in the Invaders' Promenade, you owe us. My prophecy says that just like us, our ghosts are coming to collect. They are already on their way. To write the sentence on the skin of the country does not guarantee that the struggle against the few, that I am the one who owes something, will cease. It's just a form of cutting the word, and the word is my trauma. Am I bigger than my trauma? Because if the word, which is my trauma, never stops doing its work, then being bigger than the word is my counter word. Sometimes I feel that the void that swallows me every morning and every night is a continuation of the void in my bank account. I feel that the self-destructive rush that consumes me from now to the evening is inversely proportional to the assassin call of the Serviço de Estrangeiros e Fronteiras. I am bigger than this mathematics. Once he said that I could get in there as an ox in a porcelain shop. Yesterday, after seeing he said, the bishop said that sadness will always occur to the bishop's bombers. The price you pay for destroying the whole shit that fucks you up is to notice too late that the explosion also leads to your destruction. I was pushed to the extreme and I was soon there. As the bishop said, we are exterminators. Life's short. Fatalism. We are alone with the pain of our position. And if I take a second and pull my head outside of the spiral in which I'm drawn, I get to an immediate conclusion. Or I stop, or it stops me. I read you. Painter, paint me a crazy jail, mad watercolor cells. Poet, how old is suffering? Write it in yellow lead. God, make me a sky on my glass ceiling. I need stars now. To lead through this atmosphere of shrieks and private hells, entrances and exits. In, out, up, down, the civic seesaw. Hear me now. Hear me now. Always here somehow. Painter, paint me a crazy jail, mad watercolor cells. Poet, How old is suffering? Write it in yellow lead. God, make me a sky on my glass ceiling. I need stars now to lead through this atmosphere of shrieks and private house, entrances and exits, in, out, up, down, the civic seesaw. Hear me now. Hear me now. Always here somehow. Hear me now. Hear me now. Always here somehow. Always here somehow. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I will read from the thesis titled Seriality. The perennial failure of Homo aestheticus requires the perpetual renewal of the aesthetic, an operation which, irrespective of its beauties or horrors, could not help but be the renewal of catastrophe. But this history of aesthetic revitalization is preceded and exceeded by another kind of innovation, which we may call aesthetic, even as the aesthetic can never account for it. What then might open and be opened by an inquiry into Black practices of seriality? What takes form or is deformed in the diffusion of terror and violence perpetrated under the rubric of pleasure, paternalism, and property, as Saidiya Hartman prefers? How to come to terms with such serial self-fashioning without recourse to an idea of the open, in which boundlessness becomes only another name for frontier, which is to say an enclosure, an expropriation, a clearing. For the interminable historicity and impossible history of Blackness has always come before the horizonality of man's freedom as its effaced footing and ineluctable limit. How do we regard the insistent and ongoing decomposition of the Black figure in the midst of contemporary art's simultaneous exaltation and reduction or relegation of the figural to the scene of racial representation? How do we comprehend such figurations as part of a suite of interventions, an epigraphic seriality, as Fred Moten might put it, which denotes not the refusal of serially imposed violence as political end, but rather the reanimate means through which any aesthetic inquiry into the social life of forms must pass? We insist that even as such means bear the terrible burden of diffusive terror and the terror of diffusion, Black seriality cannot be thought of as reducible to separability, sequentiality, or the determinacy of individuated forms and objects. In other words, our aesthetic thinking refuses to presume Black seriality as wholly coterminous and coextensive with the serial imposition of anti-Black violence that constitutes the modern field of representation and the history of form, as if the violent enumeration of Black bodies were truly a ledger of or accounting for injury. Here, Black art finds an anticipatory rapport with avant-garde art movements and their respective performances of refusal, the rejection of modernism's gridded dispossession, for instance, which is also a cartography of disposability, disregard, abusive violation, cultural erasure, and social death. However, the very fact that these performances are both denied to and refused by Blackness throws into sharp relief the radical disjuncture between these respective modalities and traditions of artistic labor. Black artistic labor, which takes the fabric and substance of social existence as an alternative means of production, refracts the conceptual legacies of the autonomous totality of the artwork and wonders about the image left on the retina. Rather than thinking Blackness as difference, notwithstanding worldly violence, we regard the serial recomposition and decomposition of Blackness as incitation to an utterly divergent gestic imagination. Our critical attentiveness to these incitements remains attuned to a gestural difference that is irreducible both to the serial violence of the racial regime of representation and to the so-called politics that clamors for recognition within it. Now I'd like to invite Gabby and Kovo.
Thank you very much. And thank you to everyone who made this gathering possible and everyone who's here attending. In a text that is titled Destruction Styles, Black Aesthetics and Rapture and Capture, the text is titled Destruction Styles, Black Aesthetics of Rapture and Capture. The artist Thulile Gamedze reflects on the seemingly unified resolve of Cecil John Rhodes, or a resolve that is symbolized by the spectacular mechanical airlifting of the statue of Cecil John Rhodes from the grounds of the University of Cape Town, and how this photo op moment in turn boosted the image of the African University, and whilst obliterating a movement embodying what she describes as improvised, if strategic instances of chaotic disruption directed by radically critical readings of the South African status quo. Gamedze and many others preferred the image to be one of explosion, coercion, or even a beheading. The unified resolve or cosmetic removal following the glorious informed chaos of the movement reflects a conflict in the field of aesthetics and what many Black artists have historically have had to endure, resist, and refuse. The protest movements the protest movement comprising of young people who became known as the Follists occupied the present, which is 2015 and 2016, in order to simultaneously address history's failure and send messages to the not yet, to a future unknown. But history is often violently resistant when recalled, and attempts made to reorder it are regarded as treasonous. To quote Tumi Mogorosi, the subject's encounter with historical accumulation produces a predetermined playground with rules and regulations coupled with the necessary tenets of discipline and punishment, what I often refer to as whitelisting or being whitelisted. Black artists working in the 70s and 80s, a period usually regarded as one of the most politically volatile, tend to abstract forms at the precise moment they began creating their own spaces and experiencing the freedom of working away from the gaze of white historians. In this moment, representation became unreachable, exposing aesthetics' limited view of the other as an extension of ways of seeing the world. And here I'm quoting Tumi Mogorosi again. The book I'm quoting from is The Aesthetic, writing with and from the Black Sonic by artist and jazz percussionist and scholar Mogorosi, who coins the term the aesthetic with the word aesthetic struck through. For Black artists, dancing with abstraction came to be seen as making a claim to their right to opacity and intervention into the language of protest in order to make differently visible the unfreedom of Black people in South Africa. Beyond the language that had been established for our transitioning or becoming. Abstraction was a direct refusal to white art historical terms such as township art or township artist, and or at worst, transitional art or artist. The late artist, writer, curator, and co-founder of the Tupelo Workshop, David Kolwane, often said, our major issue at the time was the labeling of Black artists' work. The work baggage is a direct critique of this art historical mode. Kolwane created a collage that includes packages, envelopes, exhibition invitation cards, magazines from the USA and South Africa, magazine pages that reveal the uneasy problematics of framing Black artists, mostly within events framed under Black History Month or treating Africa in a homogenizing case. In an art historical self-correcting essay from 1988, Anitra Nettleton of Wits University wrote, and I quote, "In adhering to the notion of the transitional, we were adhering to a notion of development, which itself carried connotations of a movement from less to more sophisticated, from non-art to art, or more accurately, from unconscious to conscious art." Also, adherence to this idea bestowed the objects classified as transitional a value and legitimacy that inhered in their supposed traditional base, particularly on those transitional works which were mass-produced. To claim abstraction, therefore, continues to be a way of rearranging narratives, of messing shit up as a way of taking care of one's own identity, because we have seen how cosmetically bringing things down allows a space for them to rise in a different form, like a letter addressed to an unknown known power, to time occupied from one pandemic to another, mutating, remixing, cycling, returning, the changing same. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabi. Generativity. If the poetical artwork is no longer preoccupied with the perils of departing from the onto-epistemology of modernity and its rendering of existence through the certainties of being, then how might aesthetic considerations start from and stay with the object, which is at the same time thing as well as commodity and other, without returning to man or the subject, the human or humanity, the ego or subjectivity? If our aesthetic thought begins with the other as commodity, as Hortense Spillers recalls, does it unavoidably reconfront the violence that is modernity's condition of possibility, devastating any solace that might be found through the figurations of the colonial, racial, and cis heteropatriarchal matrix? Does such a thought inevitably reinscribe subjugation as origin and horizon? Or does the aesthetic as thematized in and as Black existence as a radically disruptive ethical orientation stage a devastating confrontation with modern philosophy that ultimately targets its aesthetic, theoretical, and ethical ground? What happens when Blackness guides considerations of the aesthetic, the ethical, and the theoretical? Here are two propositions. A, Black study recalls the sonic and mobilizes it against the discursive closure of Blackness in pathology. And B, in doing so, disarranges the post-Enlightenment onto epistemological field. Blackness as object unsettles the aesthetic ground upon which the transparent eye emerges. For this reason, the analysis and poiesis of Black existence challenges the tenets of social theory and aesthetic theory alike, precisely because, as a reference to total violence, it breaks through the enclosure that is discourse and exposes the limitations of both post-Enlightenment versions of modern ontology, the philosophical and the sociological. Black study reorients the conversation in the contemporary international art scene as it introduces to the critical tools of contemporary philosophy a set of concepts, formulations, and questions that bypass, without ignoring, what would have otherwise remained the letter's undisturbed Eurocentric core. Black aesthetics, that is that which fosters, facilitates, and modulates Black enunciation, signals an other side for the analysis of artistic creation, collective existence, and political practice. As such, it provides the basis for a project that militates against and serially undermines the modern liberal political architecture in its violent post-Enlightenment configuration and operations, as well as the fascistic doubles that liberalism at once requires, solicits, and half-heartedly decries. Black aesthetics is an utterance that, in its imminent derangement of modernity's grammar, marks and is marked by the art of passage without coordinates or arrival, the art of life in departure. Thank you.
Thank you to everyone. Thank you, Denise. Thank you, Jota. Thank you, Rizvana, Gabi, Otolith, Anjali, and Kojo. I want to first begin by inviting folks to put your questions in the Q&A box. I guess we call it a box now. And I have the challenging task of beginning our conversation. And I guess I want to begin our conversation by simply sort of marking what I'm hearing, listening, seeing in the conversation between the six of you. And moving from the question that you pose, as an open proposition of why rethink aesthetics now, into what you ask us to do in order to rethink it, which is to engage in the work of poetics, right? Or to engage the poetical artwork, right? And then moving from there to rethinking aesthetics in relationship to Blackness, to arrive at something that might be Black aesthetics as poetics. And so that's the journey that I feel like you're taking us on through each of the keywords that you're enunciating. And at the same time, to be able to do that, to stage that poetical work through three poetical interventions, one by way of voice, cacophony, dissonance, another by way of a speech act performance, another by way of an engagement with artwork that uses movement to mesh it up, as Gabi would say. So I guess the question that I want to pose is, given that chain of interactions, I'd love each of you to think about, or to think out loud about, what is the stakes of this reclamation of aesthetics, even through the lens of poetical work. Because it's not about whether or not, to me, Black aesthetics is something we can think with, or something that can be utterly disruptive. It's the question that I always encounter in my work about, okay, and particularly for Denise and for Rizvana, who in your previous work have also had a critical relationship to aesthetics. I want to understand more about the stakes of making the move, of making the provocation that you're making. And what does it mean to also be working with that for the artists, curator, thinkers that we have just actually made that kind of poetical utterance. So I'm going to open it up to you to just respond to that big sort of framing question, and then see where we go from there.
I think I can, yeah, I will get started and then thank you, Tina, for the question comment. It's also a nice and provocative comment. And I will reply very quickly to two things. I think the two main statements that you made in the form of questions. So the poetical, which in my reading of what we are saying together, in this thesis, it is a reference to Blackness's capacity of which, are among others, but fundamentally refusal, confrontation, and the challenging of modern thinking that calls for its dissolution. That's the practice. So that being the case, then the reclamation of aesthetics that it's there, I think it's more of a reclamation of the sensible and of the imagination from modern thinking. But that reclamation, it's not, in my view, it's not an assertion of what aesthetics should be, but just a dissolution of what it has been and an opening that I think Blackness has the capacity to perform. It does all the time.
Thank you for that opening question, Tina, and I've really appreciated everyone's provocations. I'm already thinking about polyvocality in relation to the theses. I think, at least for me, there are two sort of prominent historical tendencies within the present conjuncture that could lead one to think that aesthetics is a fierce concern that no longer speaks to the most urgent dimensions of the present. And, the first being the ways in which the politics of representation, especially in the wake of the summer of the so-called summer of racial reckoning, have become increasingly ubiquitous and exhausted. And, you can turn on any sort of streaming service and see Black Lives Matter and Black Stories sections on there. And then on the other hand, there is a moment in which the sort of fascisms that have always been, at least for me, the other side of the coin of liberal modernity, and I think I tried to address this in my sort of prefacing comments to the theses, have been, have become ascendant across the globe, from Brazil to India to the United States and so forth. And because of that, it would be easy to assume that critical thinking about the question of aesthetics and the stakes of the work of art are frivolous, perhaps, or even, as I think, Picturing Catastrophe, the essay I think that Autolith you quoted from, makes the case that, sometimes forms of image making become complicit in a kind of global revanchism. But what I think we wanted to suggest with the theses is that, the racial regime of aesthetics, or, what David Lloyd sort of calls the racial regime of aesthetics, has always been essential to the operations of the racial colonial order. And that, I think, is what I'm most interested in thinking about in my sort of current writing. And also, right, this sort of racial regime of aesthetics has also been, essential to, the operations of the anti-Black, foundation of the world. And, in fact, every part of what is integrated into the theses is this idea that, in fact, every brutal instantiation of this violent world order is an aesthetic operation. But, at the same time, we've both, and I'll sort of stop here, we've both been interested in, the kind of myriad forms of Black artistic experimentation that, while perhaps are hardly autonomous from this violent normative aesthetic regime cannot be explained or valued by way of the protocols of, the sort of Kantian protocols of aesthetic judgment that these regimes demand. And so I think that was, like, in large part the motivation to write the theses. And I probably would want to say something about Denise and my attempt to sort of deconstruct the Hegelian triad, right, in insisting upon naming the theses four, which really I think was, something that Denise and I had gone back and forth about quite a bit. But the figure four and that different sort of nomination or valuation was very, very important to us. And so.
Does anyone else want to respond or have a comment? There's a couple of, go ahead, Anjali.
Thank you, Rizvana. Thank you, Tina. Thank you, Denise. Thank you, Jota and Gabby, for your for this event, and thank you for the for all so far. I just wanted to, and thank you, Tina, for your question. I mean, I think it's a big question, but I just wanted to maybe kind of circle back to the beginning in relation to the practice of the essayistic in the kind of, let's say, the inauguration of Otolith. And I think one thing struck me, many things, there was a convergence of many things that led to the beginning of the creation of Otolith. But one was Chris Marker. And at the beginning of the film, there is an image of some Icelandic children, and then there's Black Leader, and then there's an image of an aeroplane, a bomber going into the bowels of a submarine. And he said that for him, it was the image of happiness. He's talking about the children on the road in Iceland in 1965, and also that he tried several times to link it to other images, but it never worked. He wrote me, "One day I'll have to put it all alone at the beginning of the film with a long piece of Black Leader. If they don't see happiness in the picture, at least they'll see the black." And I think that for us, it was about trying to create a structure of feeling in the black, in the juxtaposition of various different histories and let's say citation, the practice of citation in relation to, say, putting a non-alignment next to experiments in zero gravity, were for us a way to produce non-aligned images and sounds in order to think with, at the time, how to disassemble the the modernity's grammar as such. It was the practice of how you, when you put things together, they produce a third space of feeling. They continue to produce multiple different sights and feelings that are both familiar and unfamiliar, but are a cartography actually of a history, let's say, of attempts at disassembling modernity's grammar in their own way, be they perhaps a section of music, or perhaps a song from Tagore, or it can be a number of different things. All of these materials, I would say, in the tantric sense, are feminine. I mean, this is Tantra's point. It's like Tantra is that everything material is feminine. It's not that feminine is limited to a human idea of the feminine, or a limited idea of the feminine, but it's that it is both maternal and disruptive. And tan means to root, and it's something that's related to the ground. So it's about kind of the relation of the aesthetics of history from below, and insurgency, the aesthetics of revolution. So, part of another project for me is to take back, let's say, the kind of history of, let's say, South Asia's relationship to spirituality, which was, I can say, which was, let's say, obsessed over by the West, and kind of turned into mindfulness as a way to kind of become better at being a good capitalists or whatever, to wrest it away from that and think more of the relationship to non-violence, and taking non-violence as a practice of a non-binary philosophy of living and of making work. That doesn't mean one doesn't explore violence, because of course, as Denise talks about the disruption, these are, for me, like Kojo and I talk a lot about Raymond Williams and the structures of feeling, and in the essayistic and in the making of the work, there is definitely a point at which it becomes alien for all of us. I think the idea to as in quantum physics is that you only witness the experiment because you see it. I think this is also linked to something to do with the yogic tantric relationship to binding. And I'm interested in how we all see the illusion, or how we all see together the axis between illusion and reality. And in this way, I think for me, the questions that Denise has raised, and Rizvana and Denise raises, firmly puts me into this space and furthers a lot of the thinking that we have been involved with.
I think following on from that, I think under conditions of what Du Bois calls democratic despotism and what Langston Hughes called ordinary fascism, I think there is a great desire for art to provide forms of certainty, to be a kind of narrative vehicle or a sensory vehicle for certainty. And certainly in the UK, that's very strong. There's a very strong turn. There was a page that didn't make it into this brief response, which was about, in the UK, the very strong turn towards the historiographical and the intergenerational, that a lot of powerful work is being done to contest histories, to contest the historiographical, to work on intergenerational processes of reconstitution. Clearly the success of Steve McQueen speaks to that on a mainstream level. So the challenge of the four theses is the resolutely ontological level at which the theses propose themselves. That's extremely challenging to people formed within the British matrix of insurgent historiography or history from below. And what I find extremely compelling is that I think Denise and Rizvana have an unparalleled capacity to make the Kantian apparatus of aesthetics, which goes far beyond artworks as such. They have it's a question of an anthropology of the human. They have the capacity to make the Kantian schema feel absolutely urgent, absolutely necessary. I describe the thinking of the thesis and Denise's thought in general, and Rizvana's thought as treating philosophy like an unexploded bomb, a device with many intricate moving parts, which you have to disassemble with extreme caution and extreme care as you move through all the moving parts. So the disassembly of the ethical force, of the communist census, this extremely careful work, which pays off not at the level of sensation or immediacy, but pays off at this fundamental level of ontology. It's extremely challenging, and it's really compelling to work through, and it really pushes the scale at which you think of art making beyond the sensory as such, even beyond the visible, to something like the fundamental architectures that support and sustain the visible. And that's a very, very compelling and challenging demand that it makes on us. And I you know, it's thrilling to read the theses, because the theses are the combination of urgency and seriousness and rigor just requires from you something far beyond a traditional aesthetic response. The notion of the aesthetic is being reconfigured as this kind of like a kind of trans-historical weapon sent from Königsberg in Germany by Kant, and it's still unexploded, and it's still threatening now. And we are all working on an unexploded bomb called aesthetics. And that's very compelling.
I love that. I love that. I want to, because we've got a few questions that kind of enter right in there. So I want to pose two of them that seem related. One is from Rodrigo Cardoso. The thesis proposed a relationship between Black poetics and avant-garde art in its refusal of the totality of the work of art and an affirmation of seriality. The avant-garde project of an attack on the institution of art and its separability from social life is regarded as failed by some authors. How can Black poetics' critique of separability and totality resist an incorporation by the capitalist art establishment? And then a question that I think is adjacent to it, from Marcio Cruz. Sonic, or the musical affordances of Blackness expression, has been appointed as a leeway from modernity towards a poetical work in parentheses, Black art. A similar claim has been made before by the futurists while trying to move away from modernity while smearing themselves into jazz and ragtime. It has reappeared in experimental film as well in Cinema Novo and in the most recent claims of an emergence of a Black essay film. My question is, how can we free ourselves from aesthetics towards Denise's and Rizvana's proposition for an aesthetics in filmmaking? If not the sonic, the frequencies. If not frequencies, the non-discursive at large. If not the non-discursive, the chant and enchantment. At the level of the materiality of filmmaking, are we forever evicted from the quest for Blackness? ? So something to chew on.
Well, I think one of the things, at least for me, I'll try to speak sort of fast, writing this, probably be belabored, but anyway, part of what I found so sort of generative in working with Denise is learning from her sort of perpetually about re-decomposition, right? And I think the thesis that tends to re-decomposition as a kind of simultaneous movement of the artwork really does sort of speak to the first question: how can Black poetics critique of separability and totality resist an incorporation by the capitalist art establishment? I think what Denise and I are really trying to think about together, I would say, is the sort of tendency of artworks on the one hand to reify form, right? To reify form as that which coheres through the sort of onto-epistemological pillars of separability, linearity, and determinacy, for instance. And then the tendency of artworks on the other hand to refuse the injunction to assume a form. And so both of those movements are going on simultaneously. That's sort of what I've learned from Denise's work, and that these simultaneous tendencies of the artwork are not necessarily discrete or consecutive operations. Then, there's also a kind of sub-comment I have, if I can sort of go really quickly, with respect to the second half of the question, the artwork's tendency to become reincorporated by a capitalist art establishment. I think in the thesis on seriality, part of what I was getting at, and I kind of want to invite someone else to sort of say something about this. I know, the Kojo and Anjali, we were talking a bit about this earlier this week, but this idea, right, that I think really what the thesis on seriality is sort of thinking about is, when I was kind of composing that, I was thinking about this sort of political call or demand to quote unquote say their names, right? To say the names of those, whose lives have been lost or violated, and the problem with either celebrating or refusing that demand. The how, withholding, it's not like assigning names to those figures provides a kind of repair through genuine recognition, but neither does withholding their names get one out of the problem of violent nomination. So, I think part of what I was thinking about with respect to, the politics of representation, how they become entangled with assessments of, Black art and valuations of Black art, right? I was thinking about that as a problem of the sort of serial impositions of repair within this larger context of, sort of anti-Black violence. In any case.
I wanted to hear from Gabi and Jota actually about this question about the art world's capacity to incorporate, right? From your perspective, curatorial and artistic perspectives. I mean, Jota, specifically in relationship to the sonic and to the frequency, right? A lot of what you were doing was exactly that. But Gabi, your work in Berlin, your work in Sao Paulo, you're in the belly's beast, the belly of the beast. And so I kind of wanted to also get your responses as well to the deformational, reformational in both of your respective areas.
Yeah, I was actually thinking on something in relation to what this reclaim of aesthetics, if we think it, as Denise was proposing, as an unmaking of modern colonial aesthetic propositions, if that could eventually allow for a form of non-catastrophic disappearance, or a form of disappearance which is not already inscribed by the regimes of total violence in which we are somehow we need to somehow negotiate our existence. So I think that also because of and thinking about what Gabi brings as the abstraction, or as this movement towards abstraction, as a movement that might also allow for a form of expression that is not immediately recognized as representing something, or has been captured by the representation of our racial positions and of our positions within the world as we know it. So I was thinking about that, and also about the sonic, the vibrational, and the non-visuality of it. Because as I've learned working with Denise in the Opera Infinita, the sound has its, and of course, it comes from a long tradition of discourse on sound. The sound is haptic. It necessarily touches you quite directly because it produces vibration. So it's not immediately rendered as a representation of something. It doesn't have to be immediately comprehended or understood in order to make its way in the relation. So thinking on all of this, I really don't know how to answer the question on how a Black poetics can resist an incorporation by the capitalist art establishment. But I'm somehow interested in the ways it might allow us to escape an incorporation to which we were already subjected beforehand. Because actually we are all somehow in the belly of the beast, if we think the world as we know it as the beast. And the fact that all like compasses us within these forms of naming and these categorizations that basically operate as vessels for the confinement of life, of Black life specifically. So how could we think of this like non-catastrophic disappearances, or the possibility of disappearing into abstraction, of hiding oneself? I remember once I wrote like in a journal, if you try to buy me, I'll hide in abstraction, which was of course a commentary about like getting closer to a moment in which I think it's somehow happened, to a moment in which my work starts to negotiate with the logics of value and the logics of incorporation that are related with the practice of like, or with the artistic practice within the contemporary art system. So there's a certain attempt to make something that cannot operate, cannot function as what it is expected. And then I'm finishing, and I'm just remembering a moment in 2017 when Gabi has invited me to do a performance at the Berlin Biennale in an event named "I'm Not Who You Think I'm Not." So that's this double refusal that I'm quite interested in, which is also the refusal of like not being there, and the refusal of being there at the same time. So there's I really think that there's something that is being generated with some passages within the systems that is not necessarily resisting to it, but it is somehow escaping it, in order to habilitate other forms of imaginaries, sensitivities, and like modes of creating and generating uncontained life. Because I don't think it's like the artwork that escapes the art establishment. What might eventually escape the art established, it's the uncontained life itself, not the artwork, which is a moment that is sometimes always already captured by it. And I'm like, okay, for now.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, I think, yes, I think we're all, like Jota said, we're all in the middle of this battle. Or, you know, or we are soldiers, you know, of this battle. And this, for me, it's a battle always of where we speak from and who we speak to. So it is the idea of like aesthetics as a question of a vocabulary or of a grammar, always kind of searching for maybe like a missing font, because I think when we work, often we find these new fonts that had been hidden to us, from us, but there's always a font missing, which is why we kind of exist in order to uncover these other ways of speaking, and in the works that I chose to speak around. It's because I'm always thinking about this idea, this question of language, which always would become redundant at some point, and then we have to you know, find a new way to be differently clear. We're saying always the same thing, but to be differently visible, but also to code switch, a language to code switch, because at the same time, as much as we want to reveal things, we don't want to reveal everything. Because I think within what we don't reveal maybe lies the answer of where we want to go, maybe even secretly. So I think for me, constantly the curatorial is this idea of searching for this language, knowing that I'm speaking to certain people and I'm not interested anymore in speaking to certain people.
There's a couple of comments and another question. Sorry, Fred Moten said in his lecture, his lecture, Hesitant Sociology, quote, Immanuel Kant is universally acknowledged to be a genius, but in actuality, he is quite stupid, not because of how he looks, but of how he looks. How he looks. I recently saw people sharing pictures of the Kantian paradigm on social media platforms, capitalisms, of Stingel's monumental reorotized images exhibited in the Bourse de Commerce, the private collection of the French billionaire François Pinault. All of this Kantian looking is completely abstracted from its onto-epistemological conditions of existence. The fact that the transatlantic slave trade is the supply chain of its existence and continued entropy. And then there was another comment question that I think basically underscored what you were just saying, Jota. How might these help push beyond ocular-centric notions of racial difference toward a consideration of aesthetics beyond the visual? And I think that that's definitely what you're engaged in. In other words, what is accomplished by thinking of the aesthetics of touch, smell, taste, and sound. I'm inspired here by Jota's beautiful use of sound and noise in their poem, as well as the ways in which Gabi's images invoke haptics or touch through the portrayal of rough walls, soft fabric, dripping paint, and dirt-soaked and soiled pieces of damage. And that one was from Amber Henry. And so here a question. Oh God, now we're getting started. I'm curious to hear whether you think this tensioning of the aesthetic or the recognition of the aesthetic as a precondition to modernity produces any tension or might deform in any way the writing of theory. What other forms of writing of theory may take, what other forms might the writing of theory take when invested in this kind of question or questions or quest posed towards aesthetic practice? Okay. And then one more, how this is directed to Denise and everyone, how to use racial dialectics as an anthropological tool, how to analyze racial indicators, markers to understand how and why total violence affects so many Black lives throughout the global territory. I love bundling questions, not simply because it makes me talk a lot, but because it makes everybody think more. Denise, did you want to respond?
Yes, I will start with this again. To Miro's question. The question about theory. It may be that the questions or propositions we advanced, maybe they, okay, let's to me they are about opening up the possibility for thinking differently, right? So if by theory you mean thinking or the stuff with which we think, then I think they open up everything, right? Like just clearing the space for us to even ask the question about thinking differently. So my answer to your question is yes. Yes, for thinking. It may not be theory, called theory, but but then again, we don't know. And then to the question of the racial dialectics and total violence. So when I call the prevailing explanation for racial subjugation, the racial dialectics, what I'm trying to highlight is precisely how it occludes total violence by explaining the anticipated catastrophes, as Jota was saying, explaining them as always already originated in the Black body, and as as a consequence of Blackness, and something that is implicit and inspires the thinking in the thesis is precisely this move to break apart the racial dialectics, which obviously has to go through and begin, maybe not temporally, but analytically, it would start with aesthetics, even if it is to go after the stupid opening of Critique of Pure Reason, which reduce thinking precisely to this transcendentally given, mediation of space and time. Because the problem is that this stupidity is precisely what explains away the catastrophes, or explain them as being caused by those who they affect, right? So that's all I want to say.
I think one thing I did want to add in response to Miro's question was I appreciate the emphasis on different ways of writing theory. And that I think that the enactments that we have seen, I mean, beginning from the need, desire, necessity of writing collaboratively, right? Which is the practice of your theses, which is also, the practice of the Speech Act and the collaboration of Autolith, right? That is the kind of necessity that thinking aesthetics in this way produces as an alternative formation of writing and thinking, right? That the thought itself is not proprietary, and its utterance can also not be proprietary and individualistic. And so I just wanted to add that to the conversation. Go ahead, Rizvana.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, going back to what I had sort of gestured at earlier, the importance of thinking with and against the Hegelian triad. I think what we were trying to do was to engage with the kind of thinking and feeling that emerges from the figure that Hegel says has no history, right? And Blackness is the foundational interdiction that sets history in motion, as somebody like, Lyndon Barrett would maybe say. But also, I think what, our theses stress is that this is this idea, I think that Autolith also sort of, phrased so beautifully, disassembling modernity's grammar, right? Really, the behind that is a kind of recognition that, and Denise's work, has spoken to this, explicitly, but that the tools of the Enlightenment are not going to tell us much about these forms, the conquered, right? The Negro, the commodity, the underdeveloped. They're not going to tell us anything about their existence except, to re-exalt them in contradistinction from, Western man. So, I think what we are also trying to do in terms of recalibrating theoretical inquiry and, in the spirit of working collaboratively, is trying to break open a sort of, new language and, new, forms of writing that begin from the idea that we can't begin our inquiry into Black existence, or art for that matter, right, with the ontological, epistemological, and ethical, as Denise and I sort of say in this thesis, or these theses, right? We cannot begin from those presumptions, right, that are foundational to modern thought. So that's what I would say about the to Miro, which is such a great question. Thank you.
Maybe I can add to that. I think what's challenging about the text is a kind of ontological theatre or ontological drama. In my very literal imagination, when I hear the word figure, as in ontological figure, I imagine a personification on a kind of trans-historical stage. When I see figures that are not literal but ontological, like the savage, the commodity, these challenging and confrontational and kind of offensively abstract terms, I envision them personified. I imagine an ontological theatre in which these personifications move across a stage of history, a kind of drama of thought. And in fact, that's kind of the ambition of Infinity Minus Infinity, because once you have chroma key, once you have green screen, once you have access to computer aided design and digital animation, that kind of ontological theatre, that kind of trans-historical moment in which these non-local figures emerge, a kind of between the trans-historical and the intertemporal, that kind of imagination becomes very vivid and becomes very possible. And that's very much the ambition of Infinity Minus Infinity. And it's also why why this very vivid figure of corpus infinitum, it's why it stays with me so much. It's why we try to work on the declension of that term, corpus infinitum, going on to etymology online, looking up the etymology of corpus, the etymology of infinitum, and permutating the different etymological genealogies of those terms, because I'm already envisioning it as a kind of trans-temporal staging, So I think that's kind of how the presentation that Anjali and I delivered ended. So maybe I could put a question to Rizvana, to you and to Denise, to talk a bit more about that idea of the expanse and the idea of corpus infinitum, body infinity, bodily infinity, body without limits, a limitless body, an infinite body, just all of those, just all of the associations, the way in which that acts as a guide to the imagination. It'd be great to hear you say a bit about that.
And I'd just like to add, because it's part of my research at the moment, maybe it's been part of my research for my whole life, because things have kind of arched and folded back constantly, which is this sensus communis and, the practice of yoga, which I want to wrest back from its kind of artificial capitalist capture, is the idea to bind the binaries. And doing so, you close and lock the senses into a state where you can basically commune with the infinite. And that infinite is, when you do experience it, you understand it as an energy of collectivity of the whole universe, of all of time, all of history, all of matter, all of love, but it is an experience. And it does take a practice. So when I'm thinking about, I was talking a bit about nonviolence, when you get to this state, you have to deal with violence. You have to deal with the violence on your own body, in your organs, the trauma in your bones. But it is not to self-develop. It is to understand other people's pain. It is to understand non-violence as a collective experience, and through empathy. And I think this is where I'm interested in, also just adding to what Koja was saying, the what is an ethics how does an ethics of practice, what could that be in the spirit of these times?
Yeah, I mean, speaking back to Kojo's sort of prompt to think corpus infinitum, I mean, we know infinitum being without end or limit, and corpus referring to the body, not only in life, but in death as well. And I think, Anjali, what you've been saying about a kind of yogic recalibration of a kind of yogic imagination, right, around the idea of corpus finitum makes me think about corpus infinitum as evoking as the evocation of a sensorial figure that does not correspond to the modern cartography of the body, right? And that's something that gets at life and death as entangled, and perhaps in the spirit of Denise's other work, right, indiscrete. So what I'm interested in corpus infinitum and the expanse, when I'm thinking about that, I'm thinking about sort of where the hermeneutic shifts from the static and stasis to a process or movement. And I'd be really interested, as an aside, to hear about this in relation to Jota's work, because I was interested in your Daughters of the Driest Rain, actually, and thinking about the way that, the way that you're sort of challenging the metaphysical boundary between life and death for the subject in that work, or in some of your other performances. But that sort of would be my answer, Kojo.
Okay, so beginning with that is linearity is the underlying theme in there. So beginning with infinity, it is a guide, an invitation to the imagination, to a kind of contemplation without linearity, a contemplation of existence without linearity. So the linearity given by space, the linearity that allows you to say that this is, and that is, and that is, and I am, right? The separation, and the linearity of time, the line, right? The line along which. So the body, the corpus infinitum is a body without space, which is a contradiction because, body is defined by extension as opposed to the mind. And there is also the body without time. So without that linearity, I was thinking. And in relation to the thesis, then the opening with the corpus infinitum is signaling this, I said the reclamation of the sensible, but it's a reclamation of the sensible, but which is also of existence beyond experience. So it's existence that is also not reduced to what's sensible, right? In that, because what's in infinity, it's not, what's beyond in the expanse is not sensible, but at the same time, so it's an invitation to have it in mind, literally in mind, without experience, which is one of the, I know that would, now I'm going to expand the answer too much, but that demand for existence to be thought locally limited, linearly limited in space, is what's at the core of all of that. So corpus infinitum is just signaling that it's possible to think without. Yeah.
Oh yeah, thank you for that.
Jota, do you want to wrap up? I mean, we're right around 2 hours, and would you like to have the final word?
I'm considering it. I just had a small comment to make, but I'll try to be brief, because I was also listening to all that and thinking in terms of transition and transmutation as fundamental categories to think this experience with the corpus infinitum as something that might touch these things we were discussing. And then, of course, it connects with this attempt, with this obsession with death precisely as a moment of transmutation, and how it also connects not by means, not by sociological means, by poetically and in a certain way philosophically, with the experience of transition that is confined within the world as we know it to the question of gender, but that might actually also signify a possibility of moving beyond the human and moving beyond the limitations of what we understand as the body throughout processes of transitions and transmutations, like aesthetical processes of like, not properly intentional, but processes through which we can engage with collectively. And I think that speaks about the Daughters of the Driest Rain and the moment of the birth of Urena, which is like the transition of the character towards the earth and becoming it through on hormonal, let's say, experimentation. It's also as a moment of like transmutation, as consenting to be more than human, or consenting to abandon humanity as the paradigm of existence. So I just wanted to add that. I don't know if it's a good final word, so someone please like wrap it up properly, because
I think it's a lovely final word. Denise, did you want to add to the finality of the words?
No, I'd like to hear from Gabi, maybe. Maybe Gabi can close us.
Gabi, you've been put on the spotlight.
Yeah, this is a spotlight. I thought Jota did a good job in proposing a beyond humanness. So I don't know what to do.
You don't
I don't have
to do anything if you don't want to. We are not about coercing people on Zoom.
Yeah, I'd like to propose Jota's final word as the final word.
Well, I will accept on behalf of Jota the final word being the final word, and I will, and I have the great pleasure of thanking all of you, Denise and Rizwana, for the theses and the provocation, Jota, Otolith, Anjali, Kodjo, and Gabi for your responses. To all of our partners in South Africa and in the United States for making this possible. We did retweet, rechat the links to be in touch with our partners and follow their work, as well as to be able to keep track of the Sojourner Project online at sojournerproject.org. Thank you everyone for joining us in the middle of the afternoon or in the evening. It's always a pleasure, and look forward to seeing you all again. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
It was great.
Thank you so much. See you all.
See you all soon.
See you.
Bye.